I would disagree with one thing. I don't think it's a question of the folks within agencies not being smart enough. At least my experience at the commission and elsewhere is that you've got an awful lot of really, really smart people who are awfully dedicated and who care desperately about what it is that they're doing. And they can take on intellectually anybody inside or outside of government and can do quite a good job at it. I think the issue is that there are simply limitations. There are limitations in terms of the structure, what they can do, jurisdictionally, what they can see, how far they can reach. Look at Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley. Until they became big holding companies, a good chunk of what the activities were for those entities was actually outside the purview of the SEC, something that most people don't understand. But the broker-dealers of Goldman and Morgan, et cetera, actually were solvent throughout all this effort. The capital structure and the regulatory requirements imposed on the broker-dealers that the SEC regulated worked actually fine, including the liquidity constraints. What didn't work was the ability to reach out and regulate at the bank, at the investment company holding level. That's where the problems came in. That's where a lot of the proprietary trading, the collateralized default obligations were. Those were where the issues were. The SEC actually didn't have jurisdiction over that. And so when you look at the regulatory structure, a lot of the things that failed were ones that were outside of the regulatory purview. And until you fix some of that, you're just simply going to be bound to repeat it.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I'd like to mention the name here of William H. White, chief economist of the IMF, who a couple of years before this all broke out was at the Jackson Hole meeting of the Kansas City Fed and spoke directly facing Alan Greenspan and warned him exactly what was going to happen. This made little or no impression. In listening to these presentations here, one gets the feeling of a continuing touching faith in the possibilities of a collective rational management of our affairs so as to ward off horrible things from happening. I'm thinking instead of one of our founders, John Jay, one of the authors of the Federalist paper, who said that I don't expect human beings before the millennium will be any different than what they are, and therefore any arrangements which fail to take that into account are not going to work. So it would seem to suggest that rather than thinking of ever more elaborate and complex systems of rational regulation, that perhaps the answer is to make allowances for these weaknesses, not work with a model of human nature as being perfectible and rational. This is the Enlightenment dream, but rather the more realistic point of view, the tragic point of view from the ancients, and that was that we are prone to folly, self-deception, sentimentality, error, and therefore we should be thinking in terms of very simple, even crude rules which prevent things or try to prevent things from happening without a lot of intellectual error, and I think the intellectual error that we suffer is intellectual hubris above all, and that until we start to do that kind of thing and get a little more realistic about the human material that we are working with, that we are unlikely to make too much progress here. I'd like to hear what anyone has to say.
Any comment? Any comments? Yes, sir.
Yeah, it seems to me that currently there's a lot on sort of disclosure of risk, and that's and companies cover themselves by saying, you know, if you buy these securities, you can lose all the money that you put into these securities, and there are pages and pages of risk disclosure. Should not the standard of disclosure be something like, based on the information we make publish, an experienced practitioner will have enough information to make reasoned guesses as to the solvency and prospects of the company given uncertainty. And first of all, you know, for Mr. Wallman and Mr. Pitt, is there anything like that standard, and do they think, and if there is, do they think companies are currently coming close to meeting it?
Companies are.
Go first.
I'll let you go.
If the question is, is there risk disclosure that companies are meeting in terms of the disclosures themselves, or in terms of...
Well, there is risk disclosure. They say
Right.
you can lose all your money. What there's not is information sufficient enough for you to decide, they could say the company might be insolvent, but they don't give you enough information to make an intelligible guess in the face of uncertainty as to whether or not, in fact, they are currently insolvent or solvent, and what their current prospects are, even notwithstanding that their financial statements are audited, and you have the opinion of an auditor that they were sort of checked and conformed.
Yeah, I think, let me give you some examples. About 12, 13 years ago, there was a question of how do we regulate with regard to the potential risks coming from derivatives. And this was a big issue on the Hill at the time. There were hearings, et cetera. The issue that came up was derivatives are potentially, in some cases, quite interesting. They have the capability to generally be used as a force for good. They can clearly also be very risky and a force for evil. We've seen some of them blow up in the last couple of years. But they also have different ways of paying off, very much like options might in some cases, where they can go along, and depending on how extreme you think something is, it can, at some point or the other, blow up. And so the view was, let's come up with what we call value at risk, and let's come up with sensitivity analyses. And with regard to derivatives disclosures, both of those were put in as requirements. So now, in many cases, you can see if somebody has significant derivatives exposure, what the likelihood in terms of percentage risk and in terms of quantification of the amount of the risk is with regard to that set of derivatives. The problem with that we have seen is that when somebody says you're building on, and I'll go through this analogy again, you're building on a 100-year flood plain, people look at it and say, okay, I'm not expecting to be around for 100 years. And so if I can build here and it only happens once every 100 years, that's not a real problem for me. The difficulty is when the 100-year flood comes along, you get washed out. And what we have seen is two things occur. One is people don't understand how to take care of what's called tail risk. And they just simply can't quantify it in a way that actually makes useful sense for them. And so you've got that problem, and that's just a human problem. None of us do that very well. The second issue is that regulation can in fact become, in I think real respects, a contagion. What happens is if you've got all the regulators basically requiring a certain kind of standard, you end up not so much with just the complacency, although I think complacency can become a problem, but that can be an argument with regard to any regulation. If you have any government or anything else, if you have cops on the street, one can say you become too complacent about going out at night, somebody gets mugged, and it's like, well, we shouldn't have any cops on the street because then people would be more aware. That's not a solution. You need the cops on the street. So the issue isn't complacency per se. I think the issue is if you end up with regulatory standards and everybody goes to those regulatory standards, but those regulatory standards are dictating a behavior that says if something goes beyond that in terms of there being this tail risk, then everybody who's gone up to that level is now going to be in trouble. So the equivalent of everybody building on the Eastern Shore, but everybody building to a 100-year flood, and then the 100-year flood comes, you wipe out the Eastern Shore. And we need to be in a position where regulators don't spread contagion by virtue of their own regulation. And that becomes a change in the regulatory structure. To some degree, Chairman Pitt and others have talked about the problem with specific rules-based prescriptive type of regulation that says exactly what it is somebody can do. And there are good parts and bad parts of that. The good part is you know exactly what it is you can do. The bad part to it is you know exactly what it is you can do. And so you go exactly to that edge. And depending on what the kind of regulation is you're talking about, that can put everybody in the same capital bind. And if that capital wasn't enough, or if that liquidity wasn't enough, and you're just tipping over it, you wipe out everything. And we've seen something like that occur over the last couple of years.